Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you're well. Welcome, as I said before, to our first community webinar entitled The Science of Learning, an introduction to how students learn best. First, before we get started, I just want to go through a few kind of formalities. Please make sure you've kept your microphones on mute so that we can be heard properly. If you do have any questions, then please pop them in the chat, because there'll be opportunities for us to answer questions towards the end of the webinar. And if there's any relevant questions to what people are talking about today, then you will, of course, we'll try our best to answer them as and when they pop up in the chat. So please make the most of that. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce ourselves, the presenters today. So first of all, we'll have our principal, Mr. Campbell Douglas, here at the Academy. Obviously, then there's myself, the primary principal, Mr. Ben Cooper. We also have with us today Miss Gemma Thornley, who's the head of secondary here at the Academy. And we also have our primary vice principal, Paula Finn, here joining us today. So the purpose of today's webinar is to really talk to you about a very relevant topic in the education world at the moment, and the science of learning. And it's something that the Academy is very much moving towards and adopting over the next couple of months, moving through to September. What I'm going to do is to hand you over to Mr. Douglas, who's going to talk to you about our Academy vision, how the science of learning encompasses that, and then we'll start to talk more about what the science of learning is. And hopefully it's going to be a really useful session.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. So as Mr. Cooper said, our new leadership team has been exploring extensively over the past 5 months where we want our school to head, what we believe in as a school, and most importantly, what we want the outcomes to be for the students in our care. We've started to coalesce our ideas around where we want our students to be able to thrive and succeed in an indefinable future that is exponentially changing. We want them to help to be creators of it, to help build it and shape it, and to be defining what that future is going to be like. Our next part of the journey was then to say, if we want students to be aspirational, creative, and to excel in their current context so they can help create that world tomorrow, what is it that they're going to need to achieve this? And so to support this aspirational vision statement and to ensure our students can achieve this, we've come up with the idea of creating 3 pillars. The first of these, and what our presentation is about today, is the science of learning. And this pillar is about ensuring that students that come to our school are subjected to the best teaching and learning possible based on the latest evidence-informed practice. The second pillar is social enterprise. This pillar is the values driver of our school. It's about ensuring that our students, if they are to become the creators of tomorrow's world, have the values, ethics, and a moral compass instilled in them so that they all understand fairness, equity, and access for all. And the third pillar is about student agency and innovation. This is about creating self-determining individuals who, through a range of experiences at school, have found the pathway that is the best fit for them. In finding these pathways, they've had multiple opportunities to innovate and understand where the world is heading and what the future may hold for them. So, why the science of learning? Well, despite the world exponentially changing around our students, one thing that remains a constant is the way that our brains learn. And once both teachers and students understand the way that this happens, we can accelerate that learning process and ensure our students are best placed to adapt to an ever-changing world. The science of learning has at its heart outstanding teaching and learning. There are 2 simple questions that we ask with the science of learning, and they are, what do we know about how students learn, and what does that mean for how we teach? There's been more learned about the brain, how the brain learns in the last 10 years than in the previous 100 put together. And there's now a significant body of research that gives us insights into how the brain constructs knowledge, how neural pathways are formed and strengthened, and how knowledge bases or schema are built. What a school focused on the science of learning does is take this research and apply it to practical situations in the classroom through a range of strategies that are proven to make learning more effective. Deep learning is ensuring that permanent changes are made to our long-term memory. If nothing is altered in our memory, then nothing has been learned. Using the science of learning means that we understand the most effective ways to make these changes happen. By understanding the importance of attention, working memory, long-term memory, and the processes of encoding, consolidation, and retrieval, we can accelerate learning for our students by using the most effective strategies. The science of learning is not about making all teachers neuroscientists. It's about them understanding the architectural inner workings of the brain and the impact that understanding and applying research from neuroscience has on effective learning. Neuroscience-based schools intentionally apply research into their short, medium, and long-term planning to create programs of learning that facilitate outstanding progress. We will be the first to say that teaching is more an art than it is a science. But ongoing research into how we learn is showing us that there are what the UK's evidence-based education group call best bets. That is, strategies that, when used, are more effective than others in helping students learn. The science of learning is about maximising those best bets. The learning process is about thinking and memorisation. The harder we think and the more learning we can store in our long-term memory, the easier we find it to apply, create, solve, analyse and synthesise. The more knowledge we have in our long-term memory, the easier we find it to take on board and integrate new learning, thereby strengthening and expanding on what we already know, in essence, becoming experts. As the diagram shows, there are three key resources we call on to think. They are our environment, our working memory, and our long-term memory. The environment is an unlimited external store of information. It represents everything outside of our minds. What your brain can choose to focus on at any given point in time is limitless. Right now, for example, your brain could be choosing to listen to me. It could be choosing to focus on the image on the screen. It could be thinking about the loud traffic is, how loud the traffic is outside, or how lovely the paint colour is on the walls, or that you forgot to feed the cat as it walks past. Long-term memory is where all our memories are kept. This could be life events, factual information, or what we call procedural knowledge or processes. As far as researchers are aware, there is no limit to the long-term memory that can be reached within a human lifetime. Therefore, long-term memory is an unlimited internal store of information. In between these two stores of unlimited information, one internal and one external, we have our working memory. This is where our conscious thinking takes place. But unlike the environment and our long-term memory, our working memory is very limited in capacity. Whilst this capacity may vary slightly from person to person, it is fairly fixed in its ability from late teenage years onwards, somewhere in the vicinity of 4 to 7 elements of information only. So in order to remember something, we take in information from our environment, we process it in our working memory and try to understand it based on and making connections to what is already stored in our long-term memory. Once something is in there, of course, we can remember it, apply it, and be creative with it as required, as long as there is sufficient use. Educators who understand the science of learning employ strategies that optimize all of these processes. We ensure that what needs to be attended to is made explicit, with other distractions from the environment mitigated. We do what we can to reduce the working memory load to make thinking and processing easier. And we have an understanding of how consolidating and embedding can only take place through a remembering or retrieval process. I'll now hand over to my colleagues to explain more of these strategies.
Thank you, Campbell. So one element of cognitive science which we find really useful in our classrooms is retrieval practice. So retrieval practice is a strategy to practice already learned information. So where we've taught something to our students, we want them to be recalling that and using it in their working memory. And research in cognitive science has shown that this process of recalling and retrieving information that you've already learned actually helps you to learn it much better. So when we think about children who are maybe studying for an examination, if you are reading a piece of text or looking over that information, some of that information might go in, but it can also give us a bit of a false confidence and making us think that we know that information really well. Only when we're required to retrieve that information and purposefully do something with it do we realise if we've learned it properly or if there are gaps in our knowledge. And sometimes it can help us to develop an awareness around what those gaps are to help us to learn it even better. So when we learn something for the first time, you'll see that there is some element of forgetting, and that actually can be useful as part of the learning process, because when we try to retrieve that information again and learn about it again, we then remember it even better. So you'll see here that the graph shows the blue line is when someone has learned something sort of for the very first time or been introduced to it. And then over time, when you repeat that learning, the learning becomes stronger in the long-term memory. And that's because we are really strengthening all of those connections and all of those neural pathways, which allow us to recall that information. And over time, that will become much easier for us to remember and to use that information. So when we think about some of the trickier subjects that we teach in school, obviously I'm vice principal of the primary, so I'm thinking very much about subjects that are tricky for us in the primary school. In maths, when I teach the children subjects like time or fractions or multiplication tables, we do find that children will forget this information quite quickly. And what happens in most schools, and my experience of growing up in a primary school in Scotland, we teach these subjects maybe for a short span of 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then we come back to them probably in the next academic year and we build on that knowledge. Quite often as a teacher, you always wonder, did the teacher actually teach this last year, or did they forget to teach time? Did they forget to teach fractions? Because the children in my class are not remembering this information. And what we can do there to overcome that is give children more opportunities to retrieve that information. And we don't necessarily have to bring on the learning every time, so we don't have to make it more difficult. It's more about retrieving that information. So not just studying it again, but using what's called the testing effect to check that children have acquired that information, that they have really learned that information. In primary classrooms and secondary classrooms, we're very good at using assessment and tests to determine what children know and what we need to teach next. I think we're all very strong at that. But what we can do better in the future is actually using things like tests to strengthen learning for children, because we know that that's going to strengthen that learning in the brain. So one strategy that we have found really useful in our school recently is something called the Leitner system. And in this strategy, it's best used with flashcards. So for example, if I was learning a foreign language, if I was learning to speak Spanish, I might create some flashcards which have the Spanish word on one side and the English word on the other side. And if I was just to study Spanish words, looking at the Spanish words and looking at the English words, I might create a sort of false confidence that I have learned that information. However, if I test myself on those words, I then very quickly know which words I know best and which words that I need to work on more, because I can't recall them easily from my long-term memory. So one way of doing this is by using the Leitner system. So I've seen this done with, here we've got 5 boxes. I've also seen it done with 3 boxes. So box number 1, on day number 1, you would have all of your flashcards there. So say you had 10 flashcards for your Spanish words, and I would test myself on those words. If I get any words correct, they would move to box number 2. If I don't get those words correct, they would stay in box number 1. On the next day, if I'm looking at the words in box number 2, if I get those words correct, they would move to box number 3. If I don't get them correct, they would move back to box number 1, and so on and so forth. I've also seen it done where if you get the flashcards wrong in box number 4 or day number 4, they move all the way back to day number 1. And the idea being that all the cards that are in day number 1, you need to practice them every day. When it gets to box 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you can practice those less often. So it might be that all the cards in box number 2, you're going to practice them every 3 days. The cards in box number 3, you might do them once a week. in box number 4, that might be once a month, to help you to recall that information and find out where the gaps are and where you really need to strengthen that information. We've managed to adapt this system all the way down to our foundation stage students, using a simple traffic light system where they're able to articulate that, yep, we can move it on because we find that one a bit easier, or we need to keep practicing this, these phonic sounds because actually we find them more difficult. And this can be adapted to various things, even learning the periodic table, even, learning examination questions and styles in secondary. We can use this system to really strengthen our long-term memory.
Okay, so building on what Holly just talked about, I wanted to talk very quickly about interleaving, which builds upon retrieval and spacing practice and adds to it both within school and can also be applied in the home environment too. So interleaving is a process where students mix or interleave multiple subjects or topics while they study in order to improve their learning. Blocked practice, as you can see on the diagram, where everything in topic A is taught together, is what we refer to as mass block practice. However, interleaving involves splitting those different topics into different sections. Interleaving has been shown to be more effective than blocking practice for developing the skills of categorization and problem solving. Interleaving also leads to a better long-term retention and improved ability to transfer that knowledge. It makes it more easy to remember and recall, and also easier to use those skills in different contexts. This strategy focuses on the brain to continue retrieve because each practice attempt is different from the last, so it makes learning more unique. So rote responses pulled from the short-term memory won't work, because if you've done, for example, studied all of topic A over the past few weeks, over a long period of time, the chances are you're more likely to forget topic A. Cognitive psychologists believe that interleaving improves the brain's ability to differentiate or discriminate between those concepts and strengthens long-term memory over a period of time. However, there is a warning with retrieval practice and spacing interleaving, is because it is harder. Interleaving involves retrieval practice. It is more difficult than blocked practice, and it feels more difficult. But it's important to remember that if you apply more effort to your learning and studying, it feels worse for the short period of time, but produces better long-term results. Sometimes the easiest methods aren't always the most effective methods. So, for example, in one study, after one day of students who had not used interleaving, they only recalled 38% of what had been taught the day before. However, the students that were interleaving, just after they had completed their lesson, they only remembered 77% of it, but they actually remembered, they only recalled 81% of it just after the lesson, but they actually remembered the next day 77% of what had been taught, compared to those students that had used mass practice, which had dropped to 38%. So this was clear evidence to show that children and students long-term learning is far more effective when you're using interleaving practice. So what does that look like in schools? So I think the traditional approach that probably we all experienced was that you would study, for example, in maths, one particular topic for a couple of weeks, then you would move on to topic B, and then you would move on to topic C. And that's what we would describe as maths practice. However, what clever curriculum design does is it interleaves various topics within a subject. So rather than students studying addition and then subtraction and then multiplication, they will do a little bit of both throughout a week, or interleave that over a term. So they always return back to something that they've previously learned. But that also looks different inside an actual lesson. So within a lesson, rather than just teaching one explicit skill over that 1 hour, adding in previously learnt topics within those lessons is really beneficial for students to retrieve that information. So, for example, in an addition lesson in mathematics, students will be completing addition questions, but within their work, they may be asked to then also use their understanding of subtraction or multiplication, or their understanding of shape, spatial measure within those questions. So they're not only being challenged on their current learning, but they're also interleaving previous learning from various topics that they previously covered. And what does interleaving look at home? Well, building on what Paula just talked about, really it's about just simply mixing up what work you do at home with your children, or what students do when they're revising for their examinations. So rather than just focusing on one particular topic for an hour or 2 hours for home learning, try mixing it up. So rather than spend an hour on multiplication, try and do 20-minute blasts of different skills over that same hour, so that students are interleaving those skills and differentiating between different strategies and topics and focuses in understanding. This, of course, applies to young students when they're practicing phonics and identifying numbers and those basic number skills. But it also applies right up to A-level students when they're revising for exams. Instead of doing a 4-hour cramming session where they're revising for their psychology examination, try and split that up into different topics, different aspects of the psychology exam, but also adding in other subjects that they're studying as well. Because again, as I talked about, research would show that that is a better form of learning to enhance long-term memory.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cognitive load theory. So simply put, cognitive load theory is about understanding how the brain processes information and where it stores it. This means for teachers that we need to look at ways to reduce unnecessary information and distractions from our teaching. In short, we want the extraneous load, the unnecessary distractions, to be reduced to allow for new learning, the intrinsic load, to happen. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting pieces of research that we have been putting into practice this term is being very aware of the channels that the brain uses to process and retain information. For example, did you know that both reading information and having someone speak over the top of it, as is common with the use of PowerPoint in the classroom, actually uses the same channel of the brain? This means that students are often asked to read lengthy pieces of text and have the teacher also simultaneously explain it. What we've been doing is trying to reduce this loading, the distractions, by reducing text on slides and using more visual cues to help students remember the topic or the context. The teacher can then speak clearly and concisely. Text can be given separately, and tasks should be scaffolded or chunked into smaller manageable pieces for the students to complete at their own pace. Another area of focus related to this is being able to give the students more time in the classroom to consolidate their understanding, more time to think, if you like. This could also be an opportunity for more debate, discussion, and collaboration around a theme or context to happen. Again, helping to build their understanding and being more likely to be able to recall information at a later date. So what does this look like from the child's perspective? So if a teacher gives a PowerPoint to a group of students with a lot of text, also talks over the slide they're trying to read, it does become really hard for them to retain that information, as it is multiple distractions. What we are asking our teachers to do is reduce the text and talk by either putting up images to help trigger retention of a topic and then talk, or let the students read the slide without them speaking first. I'm very lucky to be able to see a lot of teaching and learning that goes on in the secondary school, and we've been watching our teachers try out these different ways and approaches. I saw a fantastic PE lesson last week, which is about theory, where the teacher actually reduced the amount of text that she had on the slide and allowed the students to actually think about the context and the thing that they were learning. And what actually happened in that lesson was the students were able to recall the information that they had learned previously in order to build on their examination answer. It gives the students time to practice what they're doing, and it also helps to remember and recall information at a later date. Another example of this is in drama. Allowing students to read the script extract first before reading it as a group helps the student to retain more information about that script rather than just reading it aloud cold for the first time. As a drama teacher, this is something that I've been trialing as well. The tasks related to the script would then be broken into scaffolded activities that build towards the bigger picture outcome. This means that when students then get to practically respond to the script, they've already had the opportunity to form ideas about the character, for example, that they are playing, and apply that to the performance. This approach to teaching the more lengthy pieces for GCSE and A-level have allowed for greater success in written examinations and assessment, where recall is incredibly significant for the higher grade bands. So what can you do at home to help? So to help with triggering working memory and training retrieval at home, taking away distractions when you're having a conversation at dinner or after school in the car will help your child to focus on the practice of recall. Time away from their device to simply talk and debate with you about a topic they are learning in school is a great place to start. Allowing them to articulate their understanding through telling at primary age is also another great way of allowing your child to process new information. The working memory can only hold around 4 to 7 pieces of information in it before it's forgotten. So allowing your child to revisit topics and themes with you at home becomes practice or rehearsal that you can see there on the slide and has more chance of being stored in the long-term memory. Learning rote from textbooks and cramming for tests will only ever result in things never making it past the working memory stage. I hope you found that helpful. Thank you.
Okay, similarly related to the cognitive load theory is what we call dual coding. And this is the theory that our brain receives information in one of two formats, either visually or verbally. It's important to understand at this point of the explanation that the written word is actually taken in as verbal information. We process that verbally in our minds. If we receive new information in one of these formats, our brain has to construct its own ideas around what the meaning may be. Dual coding theory addresses this issue by creating meaning through both visual and verbal means. This visual and verbal information is processed differently along two separate channels in our minds. These channels are independent of each other, but do form links and associations at certain points in time. As visual information is taken in by the brain, it's held in our working memory in what we call the visuospatial sketchpad, whilst the verbal information is taken in and held in an auditory loop. As this information is taken in, like all new information, it limits the storage capacity of our working memories. If we can provide both to students, images that reinforce the verbal information or verbal information that reinforces the image, because it enters through two separate channels, then we are enhancing the encoding process, otherwise known as learning. By using both the verbal and the visual, meaning is gained more quickly and a double memory trace is formed, which greatly enhances a student's chance of remembering the new information. As Ms. Thornley has already pointed out, one of the worst things teachers can do is present text-heavy resources, either readings or PPTs, and explain at the same time. This means the brain is having to deal with two lots of information coming in through the same auditory channel, which overloads the working memory. What we can do in classrooms is to use visuals only for communicating complex ideas. Images, if chosen correctly for their clarity, enable students to rapidly gain understanding, whilst at the same time embedding the information in their long-term memory more quickly. Some examples of how teachers can create dual coding in their lessons include using graphic organizers, visual mind maps, infographics, sketch notes, creating posters, visual timelines, diagrams, icons, and descriptions. Here at our academy, teachers always look for opportunities where they can to use dual coding to optimize learning. What parents can do to assist at home, depending on the year levels, of course, is to encourage the use of diagrams, graphics, pictorial representations, infographics, and mind maps when students are studying, revising, or completing homework. Don't shy away from the pictorial aspect of learning. Really emphasizing the importance of encoding to your children and that our brain uses these two available channels and that will help the learning, will certainly help them in their learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. So that kind of draws to an end to our webinar. Obviously, we've covered quite a lot of content and research in a very short space of time, but hopefully the aim of this session was to really give you some practical ideas of how to take some of this science of learning and apply it at home. One of the key messages we want to share is obviously that the 4 people that have been talking today are part of the leadership here at the Academy, and by the end of this term we will be the first Academy leadership team across Dubai and possibly the world as well to have all been certified in the science of education, a program led by Evidence Education in the UK. If you do have any questions now, please pop them in the chat about kind of what you've heard, questions about how you can continue to implement strategies at home. But what I just while you're just asking questions, there was one final tip that I wanted to touch upon in terms of retrieval practice. And it's a game that you can play at home, and you can play this with the A-level students can play it at home right down to our foundation stage, and it's entitled very cleverly the dice game. Basically, if you have a number of questions kind of mapped out in terms of mathematics or whatever subject you want your child to study, or subjects that should I say, you tie one of those numbers on the dice, 1 to 6, with each subject. So number 1 could be a mathematics addition questions. Number 2 could be your psychology questions that you're preparing for, and all the way up to 6. You simply roll the dice, and then you answer and retrieve the learning from your memory in order to answer the questions. By rolling the dice, you're practicing interleaving. You're simplifying the focus with focusing on one aspect at a time, which helps with cognitive load. And of course, it's really good retrieval practice for students when preparing for examinations, but also when just embedding that knowledge at a very early age in the foundation stage as well. I can't see any other questions. So if you do have any questions once this webinar is over, feel free to contact me directly via my email. You should hopefully have all received the email this morning. Or feel free to come and see us here at the Academy. We're happy to talk to you further about what we're trying to achieve through the Science of Learning. If you don't have any questions, then thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.